We are here again at Kindred Couples, and we're going to have our second lesson in the book of Daniel. It's an exciting time, and I'm really glad that you all are here with us tonight. And I hope we'll get the PowerPoint and everything working, because tonight we have quite a bit of territory to cover, and the graphics will help understand all that's going on. Last week, we introduced the book as a whole, and we are dealing with the judgment of the Jews, the decline of Judah, the fall of Israel, etc. This week, we're actually going to be looking a little bit into Daniel 1, verses 1 through 7, and next week, we'll do verses 8 through 16. So Daniel could not be a more timely study for us, or a more exciting one. I think it's really timely in what's going on in our culture today. And you, I trust, will get much out of it, and much more if you actively engage, as I'm going to suggest you do two things. One is that you read it daily, and the second is that you take notes. As we mentioned last week, there's various gateways that information gets into our brain. We have auditory, kinesthetic, visual, and I'm going to suggest we use all of those rather than just listen, just the auditory. If we listen and we read, such as PowerPoint, and also we take notes, so we have a kinesthetic thing going on there, that's the best way to learn. So I'm going to invite you to engage all your senses, at least those three of your senses, involved with the lesson, reading every day some part of the book of Daniel, and writing out notes to yourself. And we'll start by reading a little portion of Daniel now. As I mentioned last week, there are key verses from Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 4. Today we're going to look at, for a moment as our kind of focus, is Daniel 2:22. He removes kings and sets up kings. This is the focus of our study tonight. God is in control. He is faithful. And trust in him should motivate us to be faithful as well. We read in Daniel 2:20 through 22, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden thoughts. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells in him." So we are going to use that little phrase, "He removes kings and sets up kings," as a reminder about God and his infiniteness and how big and totally other he is, and see how this was involved in the book of Daniel. First verse, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God." Now, hold on. We need a little bit of historical context here. Who is Jehoiakim? Who is Nebuchadnezzar? Why can't they get along? Why can't we all just get along, right? Why would God give the Jewish king into the hands of a pagan king and allow him to ransack the temple of God? We need some historical context here. Well, it starts with the issues between the North and the South. Not the North and the South of America, not the Union and the Confederacy. No. The kingdom was split after David and Solomon. The kingdom was divided between the North and the South, the North being Israel, the South being Judah. The history of Judah, the southern kingdom, is checkered with kings, some of whom were good, and some of whom were not. But the northern kingdom didn't have any good kings, not one. Now, the north had the majority of the tribes. And you can see on this map, and it shows the various boundaries that the tribes were given and the land that they occupied. And the 10 tribes were in the north, most of them. And then you have, in the south, 2 tribes, Judah and the little tribe of Benjamin. You can see those in the red circle. So these are the north and the south tribes, and they split and did not get along. In 722, the northern kingdom in Samaria, that was the north, was taken captive by the Assyrians. And as you can see in the map, their capital was Nineveh. Now, they were the big players in town. They were the big military power, and they controlled the whole region. And they decided to come down from Nineveh and conquer, take over, and disperse the northern kingdom. And you know what? They were never seen again. You've heard the comment, the phrase, lost tribe of Israel, or maybe the lost 10 tribes. Well, that's where that phrase comes from, because they were conquered and they were scattered and were assimilated into other cultures, and we've never seen them again. And you can look at this in 2 Kings 17, if you wish. The Assyrians were also controlling the Chaldeans at the time. Now, the Chaldeans will become the Babylonian Empire. So now remember, our focus is he removes kings and sets up kings. So we just keep that in mind as we go through the various stages of history that we're looking at. The book of Daniel really zeroes in on the sweep of human history. I think in this, the meaning of Daniel's name is important. Do you know what his name means? Shall I make you look it up? Oh, somebody's going to grab their phones and do Google, so I might as well tell you. Daniel's name means God is my judge. And that is true of everyone, king or commoner. He is the judge. He keeps the accounts. So let's learn a little bit more of the historical context and the characters, including Daniel. Judah, the southern kingdom, was also under the control of Assyria. And about 20 years after the northern kingdom was scattered, Judah rebelled against Assyria. This happened in 701 BC. It was during the reign of King Hezekiah. And Hezekiah asked Egypt for help, kind of like Princess Leia. Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. Help me, Obi-Wan. Right? Well, that's kind of Hezekiah's line. And the account can be seen in 2 Kings 18, where it reveals that instead of trusting God, Judah wanted to trust in Egyptian military aid. And in 2 Kings 18, 19 through 21, you can read the account. 21 says, "Behold, you are trusting now in Egypt, that broken reed of a staff, which will pierce the hand of any man who leans on it." Ooh, that's a bird. "Such is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who trust in him." This is the setting for Isaiah's warning in Isaiah 30 that Judah should not seek Egypt's help. "Ah, stubborn children," declares the Lord, "who carry out a plan, but not mine, and who make an alliance, but not my spirit, that they will add sin to sin, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking for my direction, to take refuge in the protection of Pharaoh and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt." That's Isaiah 31, verses 1 and 2. Remember, the main concept we are looking at is God, high and lifted up, in control, trustworthy. He removes kings, sets up kings. He is trustworthy. The book of Daniel motivates our faithfulness because God is faithful. But they didn't trust, and so they were chastised. Now, in the south, Josiah, king of Judah, begins reigning in 640 when he's only 8 years old. And he reigns 31 years. It's tragic because he probably could have reigned for longer than 31 years. And for the most part, Josiah was a godly king. He did some good things. He restored true worship in Judah. All idolatrous images were torn down. The high places and the trees that were used for worship were cut down. And perhaps most importantly, he reinstates the observance of Passover. He's a good king. He is the last good king of Judah. Now, he's one of the 5 last. His 3 sons and 1 grandson also come after him. And they will all assume the throne one at a time, 2 for only 3 months each. So toward the end of Josiah's reign, while he was yet in his prime, well, the world changes around him. And Josiah forgets God's prophecies and seeks to shape his own destiny apart from trusting God. And he brings about his own untimely, violent death at age 39. So that's why I think he was in his prime and he could have lived longer. But after, you see in the chart, after he died, his son took over, but it wasn't his first son. It was his second son. And then he reigned for 3 months, and then his first son assumed the throne, and then his son, and then the son's uncle, or his Jehoiakim's third, brother, and Josiah's third son. So that's kind of what goes on, but we see God is removing kings and sets up kings. The Chaldeans, or Babylonian ruler, was named Nabopolassar. Nabopolassar. It's going to be on the test, and spelling counts. It's worth a lot of points. And he has won independence for Babylon from the Assyrian Empire and is recognized as king there. Now here on the screen, there are maps of these respective empires. Look, and you can see the real estate is very, very similar. The yellow is the Assyrian Empire. The other one is the Babylonian Empire. The Assyrians are going downhill. The Babylonians are rising. And you can see eventually Babylon took all of the Assyrian territory. They look remarkably the same. He removes kings. He sets up kings. Nabopolassar continues to take more and more territory from Assyria. Now he has 3 sons, the oldest of whom is named Nebuchadnezzar. That's not right. Who hacked my PowerPoint here? What is this? That's not the My 3 Sons of Nabopolassar. That's those other 3 sons from a long time ago. Who did this? All right, those are the 3 sons. Okay, you have the Nebuchadnezzar and his 2 younger brothers. And Nebuchadnezzar is the crown prince. And at the same time, another king, Cyaxares, begins gaining power. He's a new strong king of the Medes. And he arises also and takes territory from the Assyrians. So we have to remember the Medes and the Persians later on. And God removes kings and sets up kings. In 612, the combined forces of the Medes and Babylon attack Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And they make a siege against Nineveh, and it lasts for about 3 months. They simply cannot make headway because the walls are so immense. They protect the capital, Nineveh, and they simply can't break through until God. God causes an unusual flooding of the Tigris. I don't think it had ever happened like this before. And the flooding carried away a part of the Great Wall that protected Nineveh. And this allowed the attackers to gain entrance to the city. And Nineveh is totally and thoroughly destroyed. It's turned into a heap of sand, which was, according to the word of the Lord, proclaimed by the prophets Zephaniah and Nahum. So you can read Nahum and Zephaniah. So thorough is the destruction of Nineveh that when Alexander the Great marched through the area, he didn't even know he was marching through Nineveh. There was no sign that it had been there. It was so greatly destroyed that for centuries they didn't know where it was, and they thought, some challenged, that it wasn't even real, that the scriptures were wrong when it mentions Nineveh. And it was not until relatively recent that Nineveh was found. About 175 years ago, in 1845, an archaeologist named Layard identified the remains of ancient Nineveh. And you can read in Zephaniah and the entire book of Nahum to get the details about that. So they were destroyed. And after Nineveh is destroyed, some Assyrians escape, and they set up a new capital, as you can see, in the city called Haran. And Nabopolassar and his Babylonian army continue to push westward, and they take Haran. And the remnant of the Syrian forces retreat to another city called Carchemish. Now, if you study history, ancient history, or you've ever dealt with anything with the studies of the war college, etc., Carchemish is a major, major thing because it was one of the biggest and bloodiest battles in all of world history. It is studied. We see that there were tens of thousands killed, and mostly in hand-to-hand combat. Horrible, horrible, bloody, bloody battle here in Carchemish. And now Egypt at this time is a very powerful country. And they don't like the fact that the Babylonians are gaining so much power, and they see an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. They can help Assyria defeat the Babylonians, right? And in doing so, they will bleed Assyria. Assyria will take the bigger hit. They've also already been hit time and time again. And then Egypt, being wily, once the Babylonians have been defeated, Egypt can attack the weakened Assyria and defeat them, and they will then rule the whole world. So Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt marches northward to help, quote unquote, the Assyrians against the Babylonians, except for one thing. He removes kings and he sets up kings. At this point, good King Uzziah becomes involved. He believed that if the Egyptians beat Assyria and Babylon, his own hope for independence would be gone and he would be under Egyptian domination. Egypt is much closer to Jerusalem than Nineveh or even Babylon. He doesn't want Egypt to help the Assyrians, so what does he do? Well, he ignores prophecy that the Babylonians would eventually dominate Judah, and he attempts to stop Necho, who is on his way to Carchemish, right? So he decides he is going to go to a little place called Megiddo. In disobedience to God, Uzziah makes war with the Egyptians. And you know Megiddo, right? As in Armageddon. Uzziah is shot with a very well-placed arrow and is mortally wounded. It's 1,000 to 1 shot, but God removes kings and sets up kings. At the death of Uzziah, the people of Judah take the dead king's number 2 son, not his number 1. His name is Jehoaz, and anoint him king instead of crowning his elder brother Eliakim, also known as Jehoiakim. We don't know why. Maybe he was anti-Egyptian like his father. Maybe he was just better at politics and he'd been scheming. Maybe his older brother Eliakim was weak. We don't know. In any case, a king dies and a surprise number 2 son takes his place. He removes kings and sets up kings. You can see the 3 sons here, that the second son is the one who takes over. Pharaoh Necho leaves Megiddo and continues northward to reinforce the Assyrians at Carchemish. He sets up his own headquarters at nearby Riblah. It's about 320 miles from Carchemish. Must have been a really good place. He sets up his own headquarters there, and I assume he had the high ground or some advantage to being there. He held the Babylonians at bay for the next 3 years. Now, 3 months during that 3-year period, 3 months after Jehoaz is made king in Judah, Necho summons him to Riblah, Necho's new headquarters. Right? Pharaoh deposes him and sent him in chains to Egypt, and he is never to return. Necho crowns the older brother, Eliakim, and makes him king of Judah. So now son number 1, Josiah's son number 1, is now king. God removes kings and sets up kings. Now watch this. Necho changes Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim. That's the guy at the beginning of Daniel, Jehoiakim, right? In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. That's our guy. He was Eliakim, and now his name is Jehoiakim. How come Jehoiakim? Why we have this name change? Well, one, Eliakim means God has established, and Jehoiakim means Yahweh has established. Since the meanings are almost identical, it would seem that Necho commanded the name change only to demonstrate Egypt's total authority over the Judean king. I don't know why else he would do it, right? He also imposes a huge tribute that he has to pay to Pharaoh each year. So in 608 BC, Jehoiakim becomes king of Judah as an Egyptian vassal, a puppet king. 3 years pass, and now we're at 605 BC in the spring. And Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, sends his son, Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar, to march at the head of his imperial army to Tatooine, where he will defeat the rebel alliance. Wait, that's not right. That's Star Wars. It sounds similar, doesn't it? Star Wars is fiction. This is reality. Maybe Star Wars gets a little of its storyline from this kind of thing. Nebuchadnezzar marches up the Euphrates River to Carchemish with his imperial army to fight against the Egyptian-Assyrian alliance. Ancient sources suggest that the Egyptian-Assyrian alliance had maybe 40,000 men, with the Babylonian alliance only 18,000. And that's an alliance of the Babylonian Empire with the Persians and the Medes and the Scythians. Now remember the Persians and the Medes. They show up again in a couple chapters in Daniel. Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar engages the Egyptian army and what is left of the Assyrian army in the world-changing battle of Carchemish. The young Babylonian displays his genius and sends the Egyptians reeling in headlong defeat, surprising everybody except perhaps Nebuchadnezzar. Necho falls back to a city called Hamath, hoping to regroup, hoping to defend, hoping to stop the retreat, but Nebuchadnezzar gives him no time, pursuing him and virtually annihilating the Egyptian and Assyrian forces. Nebuchadnezzar chases Necho, who retreats towards Egypt, and on the way, while Egypt is retreating through present-day Israel, Nebuchadnezzar turns his attention to Jehoiakim, king of Judah. You remember Jehoiakim sided with Egypt, right? And they made him king and they changed his name. Well, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't like him. So Nebuchadnezzar defeats him and makes Jehoiakim his vassal puppet. And this lasts for the next 3 years. That's the historical context of our story. In it all, we see God high and lifted up above it all, and he removes kings and sets up kings. In 605 BC, the first of 3 groups of Jewish captives is taken to Babylon from Jerusalem, along with some of the treasure of the temple. He takes a portion of the population into captivity, mainly those who are skilled and well-educated, some of the royal lineage and the upper classes. Daniel and his 3 friends are among them. And Babylon became the undisputed ruler of Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine. The empire stretches from Egypt to Persia. And Egypt will never again be a global power, even to this day. And Assyria, it ceased to exist altogether. Now, this area that this was taking place in is sometimes called the Levant. Remember that phrase, the Levant? Where have we heard that? Well, you might remember it was part of ISIS or ISIL's name, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. You remember that? That's this area. It's what they called themselves in their bloody and brief moment in history during the Obama administration, ISIL or ISIS. Their brief moment when they raged through this area. Their moment in the sun ended during the beginning of the Trump administration when he changed the rules of engagement that had limited the U.S. military's response to ISIS during the Obama administration. Still, God removes kings and sets up kings. Just think about the last presidential election 4 years ago. I can remember watching television and just being amazed. There was no one more surprised than I that Trump won, really. Well, actually, I suppose Hillary was more surprised than I, but that's not my point. My point is God still removes kings and sets up kings. God is in control. He is faithful, and that should encourage us to be faithful, which we will see in Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar is chases Necho back to Egypt and stopped only when he gets bad news from home. On August 16th, 605, after reigning for 21 years, his father, King Nebuchadnezzar, dies. And Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar hurries home to secure his claim to the throne. Now, there have been challenges to the biblical account because they said Nebuchadnezzar could not travel so quickly across and back to Babylon with his army and then turn around and get back over to siege Judah in such a short period of time after the August death of his father. And you know what? That's true. He could not. And it's also true he did not. Assuming that he went with a bodyguard, with maybe a Praetorian Guard kind of honor guard to his home in Babylon to assume the throne. He was not attacking. He did not need to conquer to take his throne. It was his, and there wasn't any question about it. So he gets back to Babylon quickly, leaving his army and his generals in the field dealing with Egypt. And he quickly travels to Babel, right? And secures his position, turns around, and gets back to Judah. And this time he's not crown prince, he is King Nebuchadnezzar. And God removes kings and sets up kings. In total, there are 3 deportations that occur in 605, 597, and 586. The first deportation, 605, is what we generally think of when we look at Daniel 1, because it mentions Daniel. This deportation, in which the cream of the crop is taken, includes Daniel. Then there's the second deportation in 597, in which Jehoiachin, all his captains and mighty men and craftsmen and smith and skilled people, about 10,000 in all, including Ezekiel, are taken to Babylon. And then in 586, the complete destruction of Jerusalem as described in 2 Kings. As we know, Daniel and his 3 friends were part of the first group in 605. By the time the second group gets there, Daniel had been there for 8 years. And by the time the third group gets there, Daniel had been there 19 years. And he is well established as a leader in the land. And he can help God's people, and he does. So God had it all set up in advance. He removes kings and sets up kings. 2 King 24, we read, in his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him, and the Lord sent against him the Chaldeans, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord. So Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and Jehoiachin, his son, reigned at his place. And the king of Egypt did not come again out of his land. For the king of Babylon had taken all that belonged to the king of Egypt, from the brook of Egypt to the river Euphrates. And then in 2 Kings 25, we read, and in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came with all his army against Jerusalem and laid siege to it, until the 11th year of King Zedekiah, the 3rd son of Josiah. On the 9th day of the 4th month, a breach was made in the city, and all the men of war fled by night. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. Then they captured the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riblah. Remember the city Riblah? That's where Pharaoh went. There must be something really special about the area, because now we have Nebuchadnezzar having his headquarters there. And they bring the king to him. And they slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes and put out the eyes of Zedekiah. So the last thing he saw was his own sons being killed. And then they blinded him and bound him in chains and took him to Babylon. That is brutal. And that is the culture in which Daniel finds himself, and finds himself deciding to be faithful. Then we read, the captain of the bodyguard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He's probably the one who went with Nebuchadnezzar back to Babylon to assume the throne. He probably had a special unit, and this now is the captain of that unit, and he is dispatched. He comes to Jerusalem, and he burns the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem. And the rest of the people who were left in the city, the captain of the guard carried into exile. But the captain of the guard left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. So this then is the historical context to the beginning of the book of Daniel, in which we read, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. Now we can see a little bit more deeply, a little bit more clearly what this passage is talking about. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, and learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. Nobody stood in the king's presence in the king's palace. These were special. They were given special rights. And they were there so he could teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, some would say brainwashed. And at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. We know them. The chief priests of the eunuchs gave them names, Babylonian names. Daniel he called Belshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. Babylonian names. Everything about them had been stripped away. They were being immersed in this culture. Even their names had changed. Now, next week, we will see how Daniel and his friends remain faithful, even as they are being educated, quote unquote, or brainwashed, even as everything around them changes, even as they were recruited to serve the king in Babylon, yet they know who they are and they know whom they worship. And so they remain faithful. And that is our lesson this evening.